Colonel Pierson will be talking about the subversive legacy of those who destroyed the American Union. His talk is based on various readings, especially Judge Napolitano's book, The Constitution in Exile. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Colonel David Pierson.
We don't have to be very close with A-bombs. The Air Force bombs at 35,000 feet. My talk today is going to be based primarily on this book by Judge Napolitano, which is called The Constitution in Exile. And he says, as a subnote, how the federal government has seized power by rewriting the supreme law of the land. And there's another book that I got some information from called Rethinking the American Union for the 21st Century. I don't know if you know it, but there's a movement in Vermont to secede from the United States of America. And I'm going to tell you why I think all states still have the right to secede, despite what we've been told and taught in school for all these years. I want to start out, before I get to my slides, by giving you a little information here. You know, when you rewrite history, you can make people believe a lie. And my purpose today is to inform you of how the truth regarding the founding of this American Union has been completely distorted by those who are revisionists of history in the past and present, who would have you believe that the Revolutionary War was fought to replace one all-powerful government with another imperial central government. You know, this past Sunday I was in the library at Green Acres, and I was browsing through some books, and one of them was entitled From Sea to Shining Sea by Peter Barson and David Mandel. And in the blurb on the back it says, after the Revolutionary War, our newborn country went through an exciting era of government growth. Now, words have meaning, and we ought to use the right words. You know, we call this union a country, and actually it's not. It's not a nation, it's a union of sovereign states who created a constitutional government for limited purposes. So we've been trained by revisions of our history to think like Pavlov's dog. You know, when Pavlov rang a bell, the dog started salivating because he knew he was supposed to get something to eat. And we've been kind of indoctrinated, I think, by our schooling to think like Pavlov's dog. Well, I'm telling you, words do have meaning, and they generate ideas and beliefs. And we were not originally set up as a nation, but as a confederation, a union of nations, similar to the European Union. You know, we were independent nations, despite what Alexander Hamilton, Daniel Webster, Abraham Lincoln, and others said about this country, or this union. I use country, but that's because I've been taught to use country, but we're actually a union of nations. The central government was not even a party to the constitutional debates. It was the result of the ratification of the state conventions to act as our common agent primarily for common defense and free trade among the nations of America. So I'm going to go to my slides now. You know, Jesus said he came into this world to bear witness to the truth. And everyone who hears my voice will know the truth. That's from John 18:37. Pilate says, what is truth? And that's probably the most important question anybody can ever ask himself. What is truth? And Jesus also said that you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free, in John 8:32. But how should you know the truth? What did he say in John 8:31? He says, if you continue in my word, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. In other words, if you read my word and meditate on it, you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. So what I'm saying, as the French would say, voila. To understand the Constitution, you've got to read it in the supporting documents, such as the Constitutional Convention debates, the state ratification debates, the Federalist Papers, and the Anti-Federalist Papers, because most people say read the Federalist Papers. Well, I'm telling you, the Anti-Federalists were the true Federalists. The Federalists co-opted the name Federalists before the Anti-Federalists, who were Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and a few other folks. who wanted a limited government. They didn't want a strong central government like Alexander Hamilton did. So the ultimate question is, are we a nation or a union of states? And I'm here to tell you, I think we're a union of states. In the Articles of Confederation, which were our first governing documents, were submitted to the states in 1777. 4 years later, they finally were adopted as a government document. But they never referred to this union as a nation. They referred to it as a league of friendship. That's in Article 3. And I'm going to talk about the Declaration of Independence, which declares the colonies in the last paragraph. You need to read the Declaration of Independence several times, and read particularly the last paragraph, which says, free, independent, sovereign states. And state, in that instance, meant nation. And we call Hillary Clinton Secretary of what? A state. But she's actually Secretary of the Union of States, or what we would call a nation. The Constitution mentioned the Union only 5 times, but it never mentions nation or democracy. And we call ourselves a democracy, and we're not a democracy. We're a republic of republics. In the preamble, it says, in order to form a more perfect union. Article 1, Section 2, it says, direct taxes would be apportioned among the several states within this union. Article 1, Section 8 says, when calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the union, Congress shall have power to provide for the common defense. Now, why do you think you use that term, common defense? That wouldn't be if it was one single nation. It meant common defense of the nations of this continent. Article 2, Section 3 says the President shall from time to time give Congress information on the state of what? The Union. Not the state of the nation, but the state of the Union. All right, Bob, put the next slide. Article 4, Section 3 says new states may be admitted by the Congress to this Union. Article 4, Section 4 says the United States shall guarantee to every state in this Union what type of government? A Republican form of government, not a Democratic form of government. So Article 7 is the last article of the Constitution. You need to, if you don't have a pocket Constitution, you need to get one and keep it in your pocket or your purse and read Article 7. I see you have one, thank goodness for that. It says, the ratification of the conventions of the 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states. In other words, the federal government did not exist. It only existed when 9 states ratified the Constitution that says we are going to give limited powers for common defense, free trade, and a few other things to the Congress. Let me back up and say that the Articles of Confederation were very jealous, the states were very jealous of their powers. They only had one vote, each state had one vote to amend the Constitution or do anything in coordination. And there was no executive and no judiciary. There was only Congress. And you had men who were presiding officers, some people have called presidents, but they were only authorized to serve for 1 year. That's what I would call term limits. So if it weren't for Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists, we would not have the Bill of Rights. Those were the guys who insisted upon a Bill of Rights. Alexander Hamilton wanted to appoint the president, wanted the president elected for life, and wanted him to appoint the governors. He wanted to go back to a government sort of like we cast off during the Revolutionary War. And I don't think anybody wanted that. In 1828, there's a fellow named Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who was the German Shakespeare. He says the truth must be repeated over and over again. Why? Because error is dominant in the newspapers, encyclopedia, schools, universities, public opinion, everywhere error is dominant. Now, Fred Little said he read something in the paper the other day, and Mike and that says that ain't true. You know, I caution Fred, I said, everything you read or see on the TV is not necessarily true, or on the internet. And then I was looking through the 1991 edition of the World Book Encyclopedia. Of course, anybody still have a World Book Encyclopedia? I bought it over 20 years ago, and it's in our little library. And it says in there, the Constitution aims include supremacy of the national government. Now that's a bald-faced lie, folks. The national government does not have supremacy. The Constitution has supremacy. Because every time they pass a law, it says it has to be what? Pursuant to this Constitution. So the government is not the supreme power, not supposed to be, but people have accepted that. It says laws made pursuant to the Constitution shall be supreme law of the land. And I remind you of Judge Roy Moore's quote. He says lawyers don't know. Man, I'm not trying to offend anybody who's a lawyer, but lawyers don't know the Constitution because they don't study it. They study case law. They don't go back to the benchmark like we surveyors do. We go civil engineers, dirt movers. We always go back to the benchmark to check to make sure that we have the right elevation when we run our. Anybody a surveyor does surveying? Anyway, we always go back to the benchmark. And the benchmark is the Constitution of the United States, in my opinion. He says almost everyone refers to this union of states as a nation. And this is what Judge Napolitano said. Revisionists rewrote history. So my goal is to convince you to think, are we a nation or a union of sovereign states or an empire? I think we've become basically an empire. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. One of my recently discovered heroes is Judge Robert Yates. Has anybody ever heard of him? There, Kevin. Yeah, good to see you, Kevin. I've been documenting Kevin. You never heard of Robert Yates, but you heard of Alexander Hamilton, right? Hamilton was a Federalist, and he wanted a strong national government. Judge Yates and Judge John Lanchin said, when they went to the Constitutional Convention, they said, we're supposed to revise the Articles of Confederation, which existed from 1781 to 1787. But Hamilton and others said, we're going to toss it and rewrite the Constitution. Well, they did that. But Judge Yates says, I think we ought to go back and get to we the people, go back to the people and say, we're going to have to toss it and get permission to toss the Articles of Confederation and rewrite the Constitution. Well, they didn't do that. And I'm going to read you a little quote here from Judge Yates. He wrote Anti-Federalist Paper number 9. He wrote by a pseudonym or pen name of Brutus. And the reason he did that is because Brutus, as you remember, Marcus Aurelius Brutus was one of the Roman senators who assassinated Caesar because Caesar wanted to go from a republic to an empire. So Judge Yates says in this Anti-Federalist Paper number 1, under the title Brutus, on 18th October 1787, in a republic, the manners, sentiments, and interests of the people should be similar. If this not be the case, there will be constant clashing of opinions, and the representatives of one part will be continually striving against those of the other. In other words, at the time we had 3 million people in the country, and he says one day we may have, or in the Union, one day we may have 30 million people. Well, today we have over 10 times that. We have 300 million people. And there are a lot of opinions out there that we the people of East Texas, don't agree with. And we ought to be able to say prayers at ball games if we want to. We ought to be able to ban abortion and not have homosexual marriages and things of that sort. If they want to do that on the West Coast, East Coast, that's their privilege. And in paper number 3, he says, one man or few men cannot possibly represent the feelings, opinions, and characters of a great multitude. In this respect, the new Constitution, he was talking about the Constitution that was being written in Philadelphia, is radically defective. And I agree with the judge. And then in paper number 8, written on 10 January 1788, he said, now I want you to listen to this. This was written 224 plus years ago, and it sounds like he wrote it yesterday. He says, the power to borrow money is general and unlimited. Talk about the Constitution. The clause so often being referred to authorizes the passing of any laws proper and necessary to carry this into execution. Under this authority, the Congress may mortgage any and all the revenues of the Union as a fund to loan money upon, and it is probably in this way they may borrow of foreign nations a principal sum, the interest of which will be equal to the annual revenues of the country. Does that sound like today's headlines? By this means, they may create a national debt so large as to exceed the ability of the country to ever sink. I can scarcely contemplate a greater calamity that could befall this country than to be loaded with a debt exceeding their ability ever to discharge. Now that should be on the headlines today, but that was 224 plus years ago, folks. This guy was clairvoyant. He says, if this be a just remark, it is unwise and improvident to vest in the general government to borrow at discretion without any limitation or restriction. Well, I'm telling you today, the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air based on nothing but debt. It has no intrinsic value whatsoever. So I'm saying that our state political leaders, Matt, I'm talking to you, must lead us out of this Babylonian captivity if we are ever to regain our freedoms as envisioned by our forebears. Okay, Bob, go to the next one. Could you go? Yeah, next slide. All right, who are the culprits? Well, here are a few of them. Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, John Marshall, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, Judge Story, Abraham Lincoln, McKinley, Woodrow Wilson, FDR. Who created the Union? We the people of the states created the Union, not the central government. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Lincoln's speech in 1861. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. And I pointed this out before in my last speech. Notice United is spelled with a small u, which means that's an adjective. I believe my English teacher told me that, Dale. Mrs. Dew, remember Mrs. Dew and Warner Harrison? They taught me English when I was in high school about 100 years ago. Note carefully the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. It says, these United Colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states for our nations, with full power to levy war, conclude peace, and do all other acts and things which independent states should be a right to do. Now, what does that say to you? Say those are nations. If they can declare war, conclude peace, then they're sovereign nations like all the other nations in the world at the time. And it says all political connection between them, between the colonies and the state, it called Great Britain a state, or it could be a nation. As I say, state and nation are interchangeable. In the wording of the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which concluded the Revolutionary War, and I put up there all the notes, I wouldn't get it. I already told you about Hillary Clinton is a Secretary of State. And the treaty says, His Britannic Majesty, it's King George III, acknowledges the said United States viz, that word viz means, that is to say, New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, and names all of the other colonies to be free, independent, pre-sovereign independent states. And the Articles of Confederation, when they were written, called for a perpetual union. But that perpetual union only existed 6 or 7 years. I don't think it's perpetual, do you? Rick, you think 7 years is perpetual? I don't think it is either. It was very weak and had no executive, as I said before, and it may be, so it was deemed necessary to give slightly more power to their agent, the central government. That's why they call it the Constitutional Convention. And the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were representatives of states, not the people in Arabic. Now, these guys up there at the top of the list argued that the Union created the states, and I don't know how in the world you can come up with that kind of conclusion. Okay, I've already talked about Martin. Go next slide. So after 4 months, they submitted a secession document. Basically, the first 9 states who voted to ratify the new Constitution seceded. So secession didn't start with the southern states in 1860. It started way back when. To the people of the 13 states, which would become legally binding on the 9 states who ratified it. So New Hampshire approved it on June 21st, 1777, and New York, Virginia, North Carolina, and Rhode Island did not. They did it later, so they were still part of a voluntary union that they had joined under the Articles of Confederation. So they were still sovereign nations. In the perpetual union, it was dissolved after 7 years. So the question is, can one state convention bind a future state convention? And I think Joanne and probably Larry and some of these politicians would tell you they cannot. If a legally formulated state convention votes to join a union voluntarily, like the European Union nations have. Later on, an equal state convention can vote to withdraw. And that's what the southern states did in 1860. Judge Napolitano says two of our most historically revered presidents committed crimes that today are unthinkable. And those two presidents he was talking about were Abraham Lincoln and FDR. They simply ignored the Constitution's basic restraints on the government. The founders were not Ben Franklin and those people at Philadelphia. The founders were actually we, the people of the states, because the Constitution was not binding until the states ratified it. They just submitted that to the states for ratification. So the founders gave us a small, discrete federal government, one of strictly limited powers. However, every generation in the federal government, from George Washington to George Bush, it hasn't been just Democrats, it's been Republicans also, has only sought more power for itself. And the natural law, which is God's law, declares that when the people created state legislatures and when the state created the Congress, they never gave these bodies the authority to interfere with natural rights. Okay, Bob, go to the next one. Okay, well, we all know the reason for the Bill of Rights. It's to protect the people from government and from men who seek power. And as Madison said, never trust anyone given power. So, Matt, we can't trust you too far. We're going to keep our eye on you, buddy. Jefferson, Madison, Patrick Henry, and others feared the central government would become tyrannical. Indeed, it has with Obamacare and many other things that they're doing from Washington, D.C. by creating money out of thin air. Ever since Mr. Lincoln's War, which I think is more appropriate than the Civil War, because the South never intended to take over the federal government. Congress and presidents have usurped powers of the Constitution left to we the people of the states. And the original intent was for strong state governments that would serve as a check on federal imperial usurpation of power. How? By nullification or at the last resort of secession. Do we still have those rights? I think we do. I'm not advocating secession. I think it'd be extremely difficult to secede, but I think we can nullify laws that our state representatives declare. If they know the Constitution, they can declare those laws unconstitutional and say, we're not going to abide by those federal government, because we have to do, I'll talk about in just a minute what we have to do to make that effective. Well, just a little side note, was roads and other infrastructure were solely state issues until the 1950s. And of course, the 9th and 10th Amendments have been ignored, and I think everybody knows that. Next, Bob. It all started with Marbury versus Madison, which was a case that you can read about. John Marshall was Thomas Jefferson's first cousin, but they were just like this. They despised each other. But Marshall used cleverly tortured logic to claim the Supreme Court was the final arbiter of the Constitution, where Jefferson said to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions is a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. Now, Louis Gohmert agreed to that here 2 or 3 years ago when I asked him that question. That the Supreme Court is actually an oligarchy. The Constitution has erected no such tribunal, knowing that to whatever hands can find, with the corruptions of time and party, its members would become despots. Judge Napolitano says on page 27 of his book, the Supreme Court has incredible power. It does. It has more power than it ever was intended to have. On page 46, he says the conception of Thomas Jefferson's conception of a limited federal government, Congress could not exercise powers other than those the states clearly gave it. So Marshall, Lincoln, and others, as I said, claim the Constitution, and therefore the federal government arise from the people in mass and not the states, and that's poppycock. You need to read Article 7 again and memorize it. Okay, Bob? And one thing, you've heard of the living document argument. Marshall said the document was meant to be live, breathe, and guide for a future generation. That just sets my hair on fire. That's not true. It's a compact that can be changed only through the proper process. And it's not according to the laws of contracts. And you got to remember the federal government was not even a party to the Constitution. It was a result. You get that in your mind that it's supposed to be the agent of the states and not the master. Lincoln's mentor was Henry Clay, and he promoted what is called the American system. Today, that's called capital cronyism. And Solyndra is great example of that corrupt example. And of course, if you go back to Lincoln, it was the Transcontinental Railroad. Hamilton believed the president should be elected for life. I mentioned that. And the government should be similar to that of Great Britain. And the states would be kind of like counties, not nations. Lincoln's political philosophy when he entered office in 1832, when he was only 23 years old, and became a state senator, or state representative. My politics are short and sweet, like the little old lady's dance. I am in favor of a national bank, which is the Federal Reserve, which Andrew Jackson, Jefferson, and a lot of people were adamantly against, of internal improvements, capital cronyism, and a high protective tariff, which is actually what caused the war between the states.
Amen.
He borrowed an argument from Daniel Webster, Lincoln did, that the Constitution was created by the whole people and not the citizens of free independent states, and that's just complete balderdash. Folks, that's just not right. Okay, Bob, thanks. So would the states have approved the Constitution without the right to secede? I don't think so. I think people I've read, of course not. Judge Napolitano said further, it states that few things could be more misleading than the legend of Lincoln as an honest man who freed the slaves and saved the Union. I'm not going to go into that, and so many people who are big fans of Lincoln are probably going to throw tomatoes at me, but dishonest aid misled the nation into an unnecessary war. He could simply have paid the slave owners to set the slaves free. Thomas D. Lorenzo said Abe did more to destroy the voluntary union than any other individual. D. Lorenzo was a professor at Loyola University in Maryland. He started the war based on the bogus idea that the South instigated the war at Fort Sumter. That's another story, but that's not true either. Today, historians are saying nearly 750,000 men died, and untold devastation was meted upon the South, along with the murder of about 50,000 civilians. And we're all upset over 12,000 Syrians who died in the Civil War, which is terrible. But Lincoln is considered by most people as one of our greatest presidents, if not the greatest president, and 750,000 men died under his leadership. In 1861, he talked about preserving the Union. But 1863, at the Gettysburg Address, he said our forefathers created the nation in 1776, and that's not true either. And as I mentioned, the Civil War is a misnomer. History has been rewritten. Okay, Bob. The Gettysburg Address, well, I'm not going to repeat that, but it was not a civil war. The Union was not in danger of being destroyed, probably had the greatest field army in the world, which eventually crushed the South. And the Confederates are the ones who gave their lives for a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, because they wanted to withdraw and solve their problem with slavery, which is a terrible institution. And you cannot defend slavery, but you can defend secession. And there was no new birth of freedom, but a tyrannical central government diametrically opposed to the ideals of our forebears who ratified the Constitution arose out of the ashes of the Holocaust of Mr. Lincoln's war. And, well, the war was not over slavery. I won't go into that, but if you want to talk about it, ask questions, I'll try to do that in a minute. And slavery still existed in Cuba and Brazil, but we continue to buy most of the sugar harvested by the slaves. Okay, Bob? And there was an amendment by a congressman from Ohio who was going to make it forbidden by Congress unless you passed another amendment to interfere with slavery. And if you go through the calculation, you figure out that the institution of slavery was protected by the Constitution, unfortunately, and it would require 60 states total. We have 50 states, but if you go through the calculation, 15 slave states, 19 Union states at the beginning of the war between the states, and you would have to add 26 states. We only had to have 3/4. So it takes 3/4 of the states to amend the Constitution. McKinley talked about McKinley and Woodrow Wilson. They had a great role in destroying any vestige of freedom. Both adhered to Lincoln's idea of it's either French or Latin idée fixe, which is a delusional idea that dominates the whole mental life of an individual during a prolonged period. And Lincoln's legacy made war palatable to McKinley. So he proclaimed a new birth of freedom. So we conquered Cuba, Guam, and the Philippines, and spread our wings and became an empire. Okay, Bob. One of the essayists in this book here, Rethinking the American Union, said Wilson's appetite to remake the political landscape was insatiable. He was indeed a man on an imperialistic mission against states' rights, domestically and old world European nationalism internationally. And he argued for a one world government. Can you imagine what a one world government would be like? You think your voice would be heard if we had one government ruling the entire world? We don't have it very well with one government ruling 310 million people. And the president most responsible for the consolidation of executive power is Mr. Lincoln, according to Judge Napolitano. He was set on manipulating the American people on a messianic mission to impose a socialistic democratic order worldwide. And he wanted to make the world safe for democracy. Well, I say we ought to tend to our own business mainly. In 1917, Wilson told the Confederate Veterans Union that God was behind the Union victory so that liberty was made secure for mankind. That's a rather breathtaking statement. And I don't think we need to discuss FDR's role. If you have any historical background at all, you know of his attempt to pack the Supreme Court and become basically a dictator. He ran 4 times. I guess we'll run as long as he lived. Okay, Bob? So what can be done to right the simple state? The state's governments must exercise their constitutional rights. People must understand that the Supreme Court is not the final judge of its own powers. That the state created the central government as the states as an agent, and therefore we the people of the states are the ultimate arbiters of the powers they grant into their agent. And it's not going to be easy, no question about that. James Madison says the remedy for a government that has exceeded its limits is to elect more reliable representatives who will repeal and reverse the growth. You got a pretty good job there, Matt. All men have power and ought to be distrusted to a certain degree, said Madison. Do not separate text from historical background. If you do, you will have perverted and subverted the Constitution, which can only end in a distorted, bastardized form of illegitimate government. Now, one thing we can do, and I've read that there are a number of states are talking about printing their own money, and the Constitution does not forbid that. It says in Article 1, Section 10, no state shall make anything but gold and silver a tender in payment of debt. Now, the federal government can create it out of thin air, but the states have to have gold and silver backing. And if the people in Austin want to create money that could be exchanged in the state of Texas, if it's backed with gold and silver, I think they can do that. And that was going to be, I think, and a lot of people are saying that our money is going to eventually just go up in smoke like the German Deutschmark did in the 1920s. We took a wheelbarrow load of money to buy a loaf of bread. Finally, Judge Napolitano suggests the following. He says, reflecting the preamble, replace we the people with we the states. Article 7 changed wording from regulate commerce among the several states to keep commerce regular among the several states. In the 10th Amendment, he says, reinsert the word expressly. The words have meaning, and clever lawyers can distort the meaning of words, or politicians, not just lawyers. Anybody can. In Article 16, which is the tax, created income tax, which allows unlimited funds that Judge Yates talked about, he says abolish that, and we should. We need a new tax system. Article 17, which is the one that took the election of senators away from the state legislature to the people at large, needs to be abolished also, because that took power away from the states. And Ronald Reagan loved that idea because it enabled people to vote with their feet, and choice begins with freedom. Finally, the judge says history clearly shows that the central government will never check its own powers, because men love power. Secession is not as drastic as it may appear. Vermont, as I mentioned, has already got a movement to do that. It's not a majority, but it's a substantial minority. The ratifiers are we the people of the states, did not give us a perfect government, but it did intend to keep power diffused between the states and the central government and within the central government. Remember, our rights come from God, the Creator, not the government. And Ronald Reagan reminded us many times that we have the power to begin the world anew. And finally, we should start by demanding the central government remain faithful to the Constitution that's given to the Union of Sovereign States, given to the Union, or by the Union of Sovereign States, by the people of those original 13 states, and passed on to the states which later joined the Union on an equal basis in all respects whatsoever. In other words, each state has the same rights as the original 13. And with that, I'll end.
Does anybody have any questions, or David, do you want me to just states do want to start asserting more of their powers, don't they need to refuse to take any federal funding? And is that possible?
Well, I don't know about that. That's somebody smarter than me. I'd like to figure that out. That's the reason I'm saying that I think we can, as I understand it, I'm not smart enough, Mike and that may be able to talk about that since he's a member cruncher. But the states can create money based on gold and silver and circulate it within the state. In other words, if you had 10 ounces of gold, which is worth about $1,700 an ounce, you can buy a $17,000 car. If you had 10 ounces, if your note was based on gold. But say the money the federal government creates, they create it up there out of thin air, basically. It's fiat money. It has no backing.
Do you have this in PDF forms?
Yes, it's in PowerPoint.
Well, that it can be downloaded, your notes.
Yes, I think it can. Can I, Bob? I downloaded it. Well, I can send those to you.
Okay.
And I think they're PDF.
If I give you my address,
Yes, ma'am.
you can put them over the internet.
Right.
Okay.
I can send them to you.
Thank you.
Could that be put on our website or anywhere?
Yeah, that's what be on. Yeah. You don't have a question? What's wrong with you? Well, you're afraid to ask them, or what?
Well, I have another question.
Okay.
In view of the recent immigration policy that President Obama has instituted, then don't we, like Arizona or as individual states, have the right to say how we want to handle driver's license or in-state tuition or any of that?
I think we do. Matt might be able to answer that. But I think the states, it should be, if the federal government's not going to enforce the federal law, I think the states should be able to do it under the federal law. Anybody else?
I've got one over here. Al?
Can I see you after the meeting about getting a copy of slides of this?
Yes.
Good deal, thank you.
You bet.
This is awesome. It's interesting.
Anybody else? So is everybody convinced now that we're a union, not a country?
Yeah.
Now, I'll tell you one other thing. I have, this is my personal preference, I have quit saying indivisible in the Pledge of Allegiance because the Pledge of Allegiance was written by a socialist Baptist minister in 1892, almost 30 years after the war between the states. And he wanted to reinforce Lincoln's thought that the nation, or that this is a nation and not a union of states. But I believe both the Texas Pledge and the U.S. Pledge are wrong, because Texas is divisible, but the U.S. is not indivisible. In other words, I think the states can still, if you go by the history of this country, and the Constitution is written, I think the states could secede, but it wouldn't be easy, and I don't know how you could do it at this point. But if the people of Vermont, if 50% of them plus one vote to secede, I think they should be allowed to go. A lot of countries that have been very prosperous with 500,000 people. You look at Iceland, Switzerland has 5 or 6 or 8 million people. They're very prosperous, much more so than the United States per capita. You have a lot of countries in the world that do very well with 8, 10, 15 million people. You know, because 310 million people is too big to govern from Washington, D.C. and satisfy represent your needs. Okay?
Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel David Pierson.